And actually, the Chinese angle is interesting. Another conclusion is perhaps not for me, but for the Chinese. And going back to that performance of Russian military technology, it's performed so badly, and the Chinese essentially use the same variants. If you were the Chinese looking at the failure of Putin in Ukraine, you would also think on Taiwan. Can we? Well, one conclusion is don't get involved in a war that you can't win. And I think the Chinese would be questioning their ability to win a war in Taiwan quickly because of how poorly Russian military technology has performed. And again, they use a variant of it. So I think it's reduced the chances of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, at least for a few years, until they perhaps draw some conclusions in terms of how Russia performed militarily and reform their own army because of it.
The US ambassador to Beijing has said that China has effectively sided with Russia. What do you see as China's long-term strategy, and what opportunities do you think it sees that it can exploit in this war?
Well, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with him. I would argue that actually the Chinese could have done a lot more to support Russia in the war. They've tried to avoid being, they certainly haven't provided significant military support. The fact that Putin has to go to North Korea to beg for munitions, and also he's dependent on Iranian drones, suggests they're not really getting that much from the Chinese. The Chinese have been very mindful because their key relationship is not with Russia, it's with the US, right? I mean, the Chinese story is they think that globalization is still really important to their ultimate economic hegemony with the US, right? That's what they want. They want normalization on global markets. They want the Americans to stop imposing tariffs. And they've kind of used the war in Ukraine to suggest to the Americans that maybe they shouldn't be overly aggressive in terms of its tariffs and its restrictions on Chinese exports to the US. And I think that's really been the case. The Biden administration have pulled its punches really in terms of what it's done on China, because it knows if it's overly aggressive, the Chinese will go all in supporting Putin in Russia. In terms of Russia-China relations, the two are not natural partners particularly. There's a lot of tensions between the two. The Russians are obviously very worried long-term about its Far East. They have this huge expanse of territory with no people in it and lots of resources. The Chinese have lots of people and not many resources. So, they're worried about Chinese encroachment on territory. The Chinese exploited the Russians. They've exploited Russian weakness. They've taken, because of sanctions, they've basically taken lots of cheap Russian commodities, knocked down prices. And as I said, they're also charging top dollar prices for exports to Russia. Interesting, if you think of the Beijing Olympics just prior to the invasion, early 2022, the Russians were making a big thing about the fact when Putin arrived in Beijing that they were equal partners. What is crystal clear now is they're not equal partners. Russia is very much the junior dependent partner. And Russia's, I think, global position has been much eroded because of this invasion. In the end, many people think that Putin is a genius. Many UK politicians have suggested that. The reality is Putin's got dragged into a war that he hasn't been able to win, and it's 2.5 years later. Huge loss of soldiers, 500,000, huge loss of economic results. I would estimate something like $1 trillion have been lost to the Russian economy because of the war. Russia's status globally massively reduced. Again, this idea China-Russia. Clear. Russia is totally dependent now on China. So I think, in the end, this is not really a winning strategy from Putin.
So how long do you think Moscow can afford financially and politically to fight the war in Ukraine?
Well, it still has reserves. It's a police fascist state. Putin controls the media narrative. He can force people to the front lines. Russia is still a huge country, big population, 140 million people. But what I would say is, the longer the war goes on, the bigger the risk to Putin of another Prigozhin. I mean, it's remarkable. Remember 1 year ago, Prigozhin and his troops, the Wagner brigades, were a couple of 100 kilometers outside Moscow. We were all looking at the flight data to see if Putin and Medvedev were fleeing. That's only a year ago. The longer it goes on, there is a risk of something happening within the country against Putin. And I'm not sure he'd particularly want to risk that. the longer the war goes on, it doesn't get any better for Russia. More casualties, more loss of economic power, more erosion of its international standing. I would think eventually I think actually Putin would probably want to talk peace now. The question is obviously, what the deal would be, whether the Ukrainians would be willing to negotiate. But I think perhaps towards the end of the year, there may be some scope for some kind of negotiation.
When you stand back from this in your position, what are your takeaways from the whole experience since the full-scale invasion?
Well, we've realised that fortunately, Russia didn't win. If you go back to those first few days, Western intelligence thought he would invade and thought it would be over in 2 weeks. Thank God that didn't happen. Imagine a scenario that he had won in 2 weeks. All those bad scenarios I pointed out, tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west, social, political instability in Europe, a massive increase in defense spending as a result, potential for Putin to go further. He would be energized, he will be cocky, arrogant, confident. Where would Putin stop? Thank God the Ukrainians held the line. It's bought us time. It's bought us time to realize the threat from Russia. Remember, Macron made the famous statement just prior to the invasion that NATO is brain dead. It's not brain dead anymore. It's crystal clear who the threat is, what it is, and what we need to do. We need to increase defense spending to improve our defenses against future threats from Russia. And also, I mean, in the end, Russia is a relatively small economy, $1.8 trillion. The West is $40 trillion, more than 20 times the size of the Russian economy. We have unbelievable power to make sure Putin doesn't win. We've been too constrained in the use of that power. Now, I think it's interesting. We've all learned as the war has gone on. I mean, initially, I think we all thought that Putin had escalation dominance. He cared about Ukraine more than us. He was, willing to do anything to stop Ukraine and stop the West in Ukraine. What we've now learned is he is actually scared of the West. We set red lines, or he sets red lines, doesn't keep them. Just think over here that initially we were very careful about the supply of conventional equipment. Big debates about T-72s, MiG-29s, HIMARS, Leopard tanks, F-16s, long-range missiles. Lots of reasons why we shouldn't do it. We're worried about what Russia would do. Actually, we've supplied those weapons and there's been no reaction. There's been no reaction because I think Putin realizes Russian military technology has massively underperformed in Ukraine. Massively. Second generation NATO kit has basically beaten fourth generation Russian kit. He knows in a direct confrontation with NATO, Russia would lose very quickly because of the massive technological advantage. So I think it's moderated what he's done. I think the other interesting angle is he hasn't used weapons of mass destruction. People thought he would. I think one of the factors there's been China. China, I think, has given guardrails to him. The Chinese have said, don't do that. That would be massively disruptive to global markets. We don't want that. And actually, the Chinese angle is interesting. Another conclusion is perhaps not for me, but for the Chinese. And going back to that performance of Russian military technology, it's performed so badly, and the Chinese essentially use the same variants. If you were the Chinese looking at the failure of Putin in Ukraine, you would also think on Taiwan. Can we? Well, one conclusion is don't get involved in a war that you can't win. And I think the Chinese will be questioning their ability to win a war in Taiwan quickly because of how poorly Russian military technology has performed. And again, they use a variant of it. So I think it's reduced the chances of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, at least for a few years, until they perhaps draw some conclusions in terms of how Russia performed militarily and reform their own army because of it. So lots of things to take out from that. One is thank God, Putin didn't win initially. We now know how weak Russia is. Actually, he's scared of the West. He respects power. We have, we can deter Putin. We have the power to stop him, to deter him, but we're afraid to use that power, to deploy that power. And also, as I said, the other conclusion is I think China will be less reluctant to take action in Taiwan, which is a positive, I guess.
A very interesting thought to end on. Thank you so much, Timothy Ash. It's been great talking to you.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.